So we start out with /etc/WLM. This is the directory that we put everything in. If you have a look at it, you'll see there's a .lock file, there's a .running file, and then you'll notice that current, in this case, is linked to /etc/WLM/standard. So the files that I'm interested in are going to be in this standard directory here. If we look in the standard directory, you'll see that the contents, there's a README, there's a classes, limits, rules, and shares file, and you can see that the shares file is empty. I highlighted in red the SSHD directory because that basically is the directory that's going to hold my subclass for SSHD, which is one of my classes. And in that directory you'll see I have a lock and a status file and classes, limits, rules, and shares. What was interesting when I set this up was I found out it doesn't automatically create the lock file when I start WLM. In fact, WLM won't start unless I go into the directory and I do a touch space.lock, which was sort of annoying, but it's just a little catch-all that you want to watch out for. So whenever you create a subclass directory, just go in and create a .lock file. All right, so for the test that I'm running and that I'm going to show you on my computer, I had a pretty basic structure. So my superclasses, obviously the default one, system default shared. I created one for SSH, I created one for monitoring, and then I created one for backups, and I put it in tier 1. Then because it was simple for me to test, I created a subclass for SSHD called Jackie. For limits, I created for the system 5% memory and 1% CPU guaranteed, and I soft capped those. And for my monitoring tools, I put a hard cap of 60% memory. I am running in passive mode, but I just wanted to show you what their rules look like. So if we look in classes, you can see here I've system default and shared I didn't do anything with, I didn't bother with descriptions. For SSHD, I just said it was SSH and I set inheritance to yes. And same with monitoring, and then in backups you can see I coded the tier equals 1. Here's my limits file. CPU is guaranteed to be 1%, no cap. Memory is guaranteed to be 5%, no cap. And here's my monitoring tools with their 60% hard cap. So here's our minimum, our soft maximum, and our hard max. And then in my rules file, I basically said anybody that's running user SBIN SSHD is going to be classified as SSHD. Anytime you see /userbin makes this B, put it in backups. Here's my monitoring tools, and anything that's being run by root will go into system, and everything else goes into default. Now remember, it reads these from top to bottom. So when root runs SSH, it will go into SSHD. If root's running and makes this B, he'll go into backups and so on. And then I left my shares file empty. In my case, I just went into WLM standard and edited those files to make them look like that. Then I run WLM control-Q. What that does is it tells me what status WLM's running in. Because I had changed the files, I had a couple of options. I could do an update and just tell it to refresh, but in this case I used WLM control-O to stop it. Then if I did a query, it said it was stopped. Here's where I said start WLM in passive mode and use the standard config. And then it told me it was running in passive mode. Now when I run WLMSTAT, you can see that it's got my unclassified, unmanaged. It's telling me CPU, memory, and I/O for my SSHD, and so on. So it actually gives you the breakdown of how those look. So now I go in and I add my subclasses. So I go into WLM SSHD and I create a class called Jackie. I didn't bother with tiers in here because I was just creating one subclass. I then created a rule that said anything that's run by the user Jackie will be in the Jackie subclass. And I just touched the .lock limits and shares because they had to be there. I didn't bother with limits because, again, since I've only got one subclass, limits don't really apply. Then I used WLM check to check that I hadn't screwed it up. So it told me WLM is running in passive mode, and it checked all my classes and rules. Then I stopped and started WLM. So let's talk about some of the commands. I tend to do everything with the line commands because they're easy, but you can go into SMIDI and start WLM. There's a SMIDI space WLM fast path, and there's a whole bunch of options there, and I'll show you what that page looks like. You can use WLM assign if you're root or if you've been given the authorized user to actually assign a process to a class. So here I'm assigning superclass.subclass. I'm taking this process ID and assigning it to this. You can use WLM to check, and WLM control basically to stop start, switch from passive to active or back, and to query it. And WLMSTAT is how you get your utilization. There is a GUI-based one, WLMMon and WLMPerf, that you can use to look at graphical views. And if you have accounting turned on, you can run the account comp command to actually list information. And then a whole bunch of commands like PS, etc. have new flags on them. SVMon has some new flags. You can use nmon to gather stats, and then nmon analyzer, if you've used the -W flag with nmon, actually adds some information into the BBBP tab, and I'll show you these. And it adds some new tabs. It actually adds 4 new tabs if you're in a virtualized environment. The WLMBIO is the blocked I/O, CPU, and mem is mem, but there's a WLMP CPU that it will add if you're virtualized so that you get the real CPU as well. So this is the SMIDI WLM screen. So you can see that you can do time-based configurations. This would set up your cron jobs. You can create alternates. You can work on subclasses. You can list the classes. You can show the characteristics and so on. You can stop, start, and update WLM. Be very careful with the start, stop, and update. What I found was that it always defaulted to managed, and I always wanted to do passive. So just make absolutely sure that it really is coming up in passive mode, especially when you initially put this in. The PS command has been updated to include the actual system classes. So if you do this PS-AE and you add the class PID user args and output it, it puts everything into a file. You can then sort it so that things are in the right order. So if you look at this, I actually did one where I included a whole bunch of tags, and you can see that it's giving me, for the process, it gives me the command name, it's telling me the virtual size, the thread count, it's telling me the percentage of CPU it's using, and so on. So you can actually get quite a lot of information here. There's my SSHD.default. You can see here that DB2sysc, which is, happens to be on my director system, has 67 threads and so on. And in a more simple version, I just did one where I gripped Jackie. So you can see that here's the process IDs. Here are the classes that the various things owned by Jackie have fallen into, and then the various commands. Then here I'm using a PS command to check the superclass and the subclass. If I do a PS space -C and I look at SSHD, I'm telling it to check the superclass. It gives me all the PIDs that have been assigned to that superclass. And then I could do SSHD.Jackie and get whatever's been assigned to that subclass. So it's actually quite cool, because if you want to know what's been assigned to the default or whatever, you can actually go and find that out and then figure out if you need to make some tweaks to your rules, which is nice, and it's something that you absolutely should do before you go into monitoring, to active mode. We already ran WLM control before with the query, and WLM check, as I've said, allows you to check the various configurations. Now what's really interesting is if you run WLM check -A -Jackie, it will show me the processes owned by Jackie and what categories they fall into, which is very, very handy. So I've got an example of that coming up. So here I check my standard config, and you saw this before. But when I do it for Jackie, it says, okay, well, I've got my SSHD.Jackie, and then that's the one that's going to have a subclass of Jackie, and then I have these other superclasses. So now when I run WLMSTAT or WLMSTAT-A, because I added the subclass, it now shows up here. So you can see that now it breaks the SSH down and gives me the subclasses by default. So normally, if you look at the other ones, you'll see Monit, I just have one line. Because SSHD has subclasses, it will break it out to default, shared, and Jackie. And then, if I sum this 0.02 and 0.19, it comes up to what it's showing for the superclass. There's a whole bunch of flags you can use with WLMSTAT. You could tell it just to show disk I/O. You could tell it to show disk I/O for just one H disk. You can tell it to show all of the H disks with the double quote, or CPU and so on. You can tell it just to do classes. You can tell it to show everything for SSHD, etc. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. And if you go into verbose mode, you need a really, really wide screen, because it's going to show you about 20 different things. And you can also get it to show you, which is useful, the memory high watermark. which is the maximum pages that a class has used since WLM started. So that can help you figure out when you're in passive mode what you really want to set your memory limits to. And of course you can break it down by tier and so on. If we look at the WLMSTAT-M, here's where we get our real and virtual memory statistics broken down by class. So you can see that systems using most of the memory and unclassified's next. But typically you're going to see a different breakdown. I just haven't coded a ton of rules for this one. If you do it with a -T, it's going to break it down by tiers. And for some reason it didn't show me the tier here, but I can go and actually do it by -T0 and 1 to make sure I get them actually properly broken down. Here it's got me showing me the threads and so on and the number of logins. So here we go with a -T1. It's only showing me tier 1, which of course is just my backups, which aren't doing anything. And here it's showing me my tier 0, which is everything else. And then I'm just showing you over here what it would look like without the tiers. If you go into verbose mode, as I said, it adds a whole bunch of attributes. It'll show you the tier number, it'll show you the inheritance value, the number of processes, it gives you utilization for processor memory and the I/O bandwidth, and the number of shares, and all your limits, and percentage goals, etc. You typically want to add something to that, like tell it just do CPU memory or I/O, otherwise you get a huge, very, very wide output. So here I did it for just CPU, and so you can see that it's giving me my tiers, and down here it's got a 1 for backups, and I've got inheritance turned on. You can see the CPU that's being used, and the shares and everything else. So this is for processor utilization of the class in terms of what the CPU is set to. You could do the same thing for memory. So here I did a -VM, so I get all the same similar things except for the line I get down here is memory. And again, when you start looking at these percentages, keep in mind that that's for the class. So if I look at system, 100% of the memory that's being used in system is in the default subclass. Same with SSHD. 90.48% of what's being used is in the default, and 9.52% is Jackie. So just keep that in mind, that it's within the class, because when you start summing all this up, you're going, how can I have more than 100% memory? It's because it's broken down by class. You can also just tell it to display the superclasses, and you can tell it to display just subclasses. Here you can tell it just to do blocked I/O. Remember, I didn't put any limits or anything around I/O, and this wasn't a particularly busy system, so you're not going to see much there. Here I told it to do it and break it down by all the disks. So I get my DKIO column, but now I get it for every H disk. This is fine on this system because I only have 4 disks. If you have a system with 100 disks, you're not going to want to do this. But it can be quite useful to show you who's doing which disks are doing all the I/O. And again, you can get this graphically out of Nmon or anywhere else anyway. Remember, I created a subclass called Jackie. Well, if you do a WLMSTAT-L Jackie, you're not going to see it. You have to put the superclass name in front of it. And that's what I'm just trying to illustrate here. And so normally you'd start by doing a WLMSTAT-L on the actual superclass name, then you find out the subclass names, then you can go and look at those. If you want to look at the high watermarks, you use the -W, and as you can see, it's showing me that Jackie's never used more than 127 pages. The monitoring software is used about 8,800 and so on.